A hero who never stops smiling lands in a galaxy that has forgotten what hope looks like. The sky tastes like ash and rust, and children die before they learn to dream. His strength can break armies, but it cannot break 10,000 years of despair. So what happens when the symbol of peace meets an empire built on suffering? The sky above Carthax Secundus burned with the color of infected wounds, streaked through with falling iron and the discharge trails of macro cannon salvos that had missed their orbital targets and now plummeted earthward like the anger of absent gods. The hive city of Velmarch stood against the horizon like a rusted blade thrust into the planet's crust, its spires blackened by centuries of industrial worship and recent war, its lower levels choked with refugees who had fled the northern manufactorums when the enemy arrived. Smoke rose from 1,000 fires, blending with the perpetual smog that hung over the underhive like a shroud, and somewhere in that choking darkness, millions prayed to an emperor who had not answered in weeks. The Chaos Warband, known as the Crimson Prophets, had made planetfall 17 days prior, their drop pods hammering through the orbital defense grid with contemptuous ease, and now they pressed against the hive's eastern gate with the patient hunger of predators who knew their prey had nowhere left to run. The Astra Militarum held the outer walls with last fire and faith, 10,000 guardsmen of the Carthax 9th Regiment bleeding their lives into the Ferrocrete ramparts one squad at a time. They had been promised reinforcements. The Voxcasters had carried that promise like a sacred litany for 3 days now, repeating the message until it became meaningless, until the officers stopped believing it themselves but continued speaking it aloud because silence would have been worse. Behind the walls, Commissar Yolan Terix walked the firing lines with his bolt pistol drawn, not to threaten but to remind, his presence a cold anchor against the rising tide of panic that threatened to break discipline before the enemy ever could. He had already executed 2 men for cowardice, their bodies left where they fell as instruction to the others, and he knew he would execute more before dawn. The Emperor's justice was not gentle, but it was absolute, and on worlds like Carthax Secundus, that absoluteness was the only thing separating civilization from the abyss. The heretics came in waves. They wore armor painted the red of arterial spray, their helms modified with vox grills that screamed hymns of corruption across the killing fields, and they moved with the unnatural coordination of warriors who had pledged themselves to powers that whispered secrets from beyond the veil. Cultists surged ahead of the Chaos Marines, mortal chaff expendable as ammunition, their bodies stacked against the walls like sandbags, until the defenders ran low on laspacks and had to ration their fire. When the Marines themselves advanced, they did so with the terrible patience of those who knew time favored them, their bolters chewing through Imperial cover with methodical precision, each explosion a sermon of futility. The 9th Regiment held because they had no choice. They held because the alternative was execution by their own officers or damnation by the enemy, and between those options, dying with a lasgun in hand seemed almost dignified. Then the sky tore open. It was not the controlled fury of a teleportarium strike or the calculated descent of a drop pod assault. It was something else entirely, something the observers in the hive's northern auger tower could not classify, even as their instruments shrieked warnings and overloaded attempting to measure it. A rift opened in the smoke-choked heavens. Not the warp-spawned madness of chaos, but something stranger, a rupture that burned with colors that seemed simultaneously too bright and too pure for the palette of a galaxy that had forgotten what clean light looked like. Those who looked directly at it reported seeing shapes within the tier, geometries that hurt to perceive. And then something fell through. He plummeted like a meteor wrapped in golden fire. The impact struck the no-man's land between the Imperial walls and the advancing heretics, with enough force to crack the earth itself, sending a shockwave rolling outward that threw cultists from their feet and rattled the teeth of guardsmen 200 meters away. A crater appeared where dry soil had been. its edges still glowing with residual heat, and from within that burning wound in the ground, a figure rose. He stood slowly, as if the violence of his arrival had been nothing more than an inconvenient stumble. And as he straightened to his full height, the smoke seemed to pull away from him like a curtain drawn back from something it could not bear to touch. He was massive, easily matching the bulk of the Chaos Marines, who had paused their advance to stare at this impossible newcomer, but where their size spoke of surgical enhancement and dark pacts, he spoke of something that seemed almost wholesome by comparison, as if he had been built not for war but for inspiration. His costume was absurd by the standards of the grim darkness. Blue and red fabric clung to a frame of impossible musculature, primary colors bright as a child's drawing against the rust and ash of the battlefield. White boots rose to his knees, pristine despite the crater dust that clung to everything else. White gloves covered hands the size of combat shields, and across his chest, emblazoned in yellow that seemed to generate its own light, stretched two simple letters, AM. No Aquila, no holy seals, no purity marks or devotional script. Just those letters, their meaning unknown to everyone who witnessed them, but their presence somehow commanding attention nonetheless. His hair defied gravity and logic both. Blonde spikes rising from his scalp like the crest of some legendary bird, and shadows carved deep lines into a face that seemed to have been designed for an expression the Imperium had long since abandoned. When he opened his eyes, they blazed with something the guardsmen on the walls could not name, something they had seen only in the oldest propaganda picts from before the Age of Strife, when humanity had believed itself destined for something other than endless war. He smiled. It was not the grin of a berserker or the smirk of a killer. It was something else entirely, something vast and genuine and utterly, catastrophically out of place. His teeth flashed white against the smoke-stained air, and that smile carried with it an emotion so foreign to Carthax Secundus that for a moment the battle simply stopped. Both sides stared at this impossible figure who stood in the center of their killing field and smiled as if he had just discovered something wonderful in the midst of all this death. Then he spoke, and his voice carried across the wasteland like a thunderclap made of pure conviction. "Fear not, citizens. I am here." The words were Gothic, though accented strangely, each syllable pronounced with excessive clarity, as if the speaker wanted to ensure no one could possibly misunderstand. They rang across the battlefield with a volume that suggested augmetic amplification, but carried none of the mechanical flatness of voxcasters. This was a human voice, unmodified and impossibly loud, powered by lungs that could apparently outshout an artillery barrage through sheer determination. The Crimson Prophets answered with bolter fire. 3 Chaos Marines opened up simultaneously, their weapons spitting mass reactive shells across the 200 meters separating them from this strange interloper. The shells crossed the distance in the blink of an eye, each one a micro-missile designed to penetrate ceramite before detonating with enough force to liquefy organs and shatter bone. They struck the figure's torso in a tight grouping that spoke to decades of combat experience, the explosions blooming against his chest in a chain of fire that should have reduced any unarmored target to constituent atoms. The smoke cleared. He still stood, still smiled, though his costume bore scorch marks where the bolts had struck. He looked down at the damage with an expression of mild concern, brushing at the burns with one massive hand, as if checking the severity of a stain. Then he looked up at the Chaos Marines, and his smile shifted into something sharper, something that carried an edge of reproach. "That was dangerous," he said, his voice carrying that same impossible volume. "You could have hurt someone." Then he moved. Later, the guardsmen who witnessed what came next would struggle to describe it. Not because they lacked the vocabulary. The Imperium's military lexicon contained words for every variety of violence, but because their minds refused to accept what their eyes reported. One moment, the figure stood in the center of the no man's land, 300 meters from the enemy formation. The next moment he was among them, the distance erased in a span of time too brief to measure, and the Chaos Marine who had fired first was simply gone, his ceramite-clad form hurtling backward with such velocity that he appeared as a red blur against the smoke before vanishing into the heretic lines with an impact that killed 3 cultists. The figure had punched him. It was such a simple action, so fundamentally mundane compared to the technological horrors and warp-spawned nightmares that defined warfare in the 41st millennium, that it almost seemed comic. He had pulled back his fist, pivoted his hips with textbook form, and delivered a straight punch to the center mass of a Chaos Marine. The result defied every law of physics that the Mechanicus held sacred. The Marine's armor, warped and strengthened by centuries of service to the dark gods, crumpled like wet parchment. The force of the blow propagated through ceramite and bone and augmetic enhancement with such catastrophic efficiency that the target was unconscious before his nervous system could register pain, and then he was airborne, traveling at a velocity normally reserved for mass driver rounds. The other Marines opened fire. Bolter shells filled the air between them and this impossible enemy, dozens of rounds unleashed in the span of seconds, each one tracking towards center mass with the precision of warriors who had killed for longer than most Imperial citizens lived. The figure moved through the storm like it was rain, his body twisting and weaving with a grace that seemed obscene in something his size, and those few shells that actually struck him sparked off what should have been vulnerable flesh as if they had found ceramite instead. He closed the distance to the second Marine in 3 enormous strides, each footfall cracking the earth beneath his boots. And when he reached his target, he did not slow. His fist caught the Marine in the side of the helm with a hook that carried the full rotational force of his torso behind it. The helm shattered. Not cracked or dented, but exploded outward in fragments, the metal and warp-touched ceramite unable to withstand the kinetic energy being transferred into it. The Marine's head snapped to the side with enough force to break his neck 3 times over, and then he too was flying, tumbling end over end until he struck the ground 40 meters away and skidded to a stop in a cloud of dust and shattered armor. The cultists broke. They had witnessed much in their service to the Crimson Prophets, had seen their masters perform acts that would have driven loyal servants of the Emperor mad, but this was something different. This was not the power of the warp or the blessings of the dark gods. This was something that looked almost wholesome by comparison, almost noble, and that made it infinitely more terrifying. They turned and ran, scrambling over each other in their panic, and the figure let them go. He stood among the remaining Chaos Marines, 5 of them now arrayed in a loose circle around him, and his smile had not faded. "Stand down," he said, his voice gentler now but no less audible. "You don't have to do this. Whatever happened to make you take this path, it's not too late to choose something different." One of the Marines laughed. The sound distorted through his vox grill into something that resembled grinding metal more than mirth. He raised his bolter and fired point-blank into the figure's face. The bolt exploded against the bridge of his nose, the detonation near enough that the light should have blinded him and the shrapnel should have shredded his eyes. He blinked once, as if clearing dust from his vision. Then he sighed, and the sound carried with it a weight of disappointment that seemed almost childlike in its sincerity. "I tried," he said, and there was genuine regret in his voice. He moved again, and this time the Marines had no chance to react. His fist caught the first one low in the torso, driving in just below the chest plate with enough force to fold the warrior in half around the impact point. Ceramite crumpled like foil. Augmetic organs ruptured. The Marine's feet left the ground and he sailed backward, his body limp before he landed. The second Marine attempted a swing with his chainsword, the weapon screaming as it carved toward this impossible enemy's neck, but the figure caught the blade one-handed, his palm stopping the rotating teeth with a shriek of tortured metal. He pulled, and the Marine came with his weapon, overbalanced and vulnerable. The figure's other hand came up in an open palm strike that caught the Marine in the center of his chest plate and launched him skyward. He flew up and up, still rising, his trajectory carrying him above the battlefield like some perverse mockery of ascension. Guardsmen on the walls tracked his flight with their eyes, mouths open in expressions of shock that mirrored the disbelief running through every witness's mind. The Marine reached the apex of his arc somewhere near the height of the hive's lower mid-spires, 100 meters above the earth, and then gravity reasserted itself. He came down like an artillery shell, the impact when he struck the ground creating a crater of his own and sending a small earthquake rippling through the battlefield. 3 Marines remained, and they attacked as one. They moved with the coordination of warriors who had fought together for centuries. Their assault timed and angled to create overlapping fields of fire that should have left no room for evasion. Bolters barked, chainswords howled, and one produced a plasma pistol that painted the smoke-filled air with lethal light. The figure moved through it all, his body flowing from one defensive position to the next with economy of motion that suggested martial training of the highest order. He caught a chainsword strike on one forearm, the blade screaming against his skin and producing nothing but sparks. His other hand shot out and grabbed the weapon's haft, just behind the grip, and he squeezed. Metal crumpled, the chainsword's teeth shattered, fragments spinning away in all directions, and then the entire weapon folded in on itself like a child's toy crushed in an industrial press. The Marine holding it stared at the ruin of his weapon for a fraction of a second, and that was long enough. The figure's palm struck him in the chest with the force of a battering ram, and he was gone, hurtling backward to crash through the ranks of fleeing cultists. The plasma pistol fired again, the shot taking the figure high on the left shoulder. Superheated gas washed over him, the temperature sufficient to vaporize ceramite and melt plasteel, and his costume blackened under the assault. He grimaced, the first sign of actual pain he had shown, and his hand came up to touch the burn. For a moment his smile faltered, replaced by something that looked almost like surprise, as if he had not fully believed he could be hurt. Then his eyes hardened, and he moved with speed that erased the concept of distance. He closed the gap to the Marine with the plasma pistol in what seemed like a single step, appearing directly in front of his target, as if he had simply ceased to exist in his previous position and chosen to exist in this new one instead. His fist drove forward in a punch that carried behind it all the frustration of a man who had tried to offer mercy and been answered with violence. It struck the Marine's chestplate dead center, and the armor exploded. Not cracked or dented, but detonated outward in a spray of ceramite shrapnel and twisted metal, the force of the blow propagating through the target's enhanced skeleton and rupturing every major organ simultaneously. The Marine was dead before his body hit the ground, though his legs continued to twitch for several seconds after, nerves firing without any brain to coordinate them. The last Marine turned and ran. It was the first time in recorded Imperial history that any member of the Crimson Prophets had ever retreated from a lone opponent. The figure watched him go, making no move to pursue, his chest heaving with exertion that seemed somehow performative, as if he were breathing hard not because he needed to but because it was expected of him. He stood alone in the center of the killing field, surrounded by the broken bodies of Chaos Marines and the fleeing remnants of the cultist horde, and slowly his smile returned. He turned toward the Imperial walls, and every guardsman who met his eyes felt something shift in their chest, some emotion they had believed beaten out of them by war and cruelty and the daily grind of survival in the Imperium's service. He raised one fist into the air, the gesture absurdly theatrical, and his voice rang out across the wasteland. "The danger has passed. You are safe now." On the ramparts, Commissar Teryx lowered his bolt pistol and stared at this impossible figure. Behind him, he could hear his men beginning to cheer, a sound that started small and uncertain but grew with each passing second until it became a roar that echoed off the hive's lower walls. They were cheering for a stranger who wore no aquila and spoke no prayer, a figure who had appeared from nowhere and fought with methods that violated every tactical doctrine the Imperium had ever codified. They were cheering because for the first time in 17 days, someone had made the enemy bleed without dying in the process. Terex did not join the cheering. He had seen too much, survived too long, to trust anything that seemed too good to be true. Instead, he activated his vox bead and opened a channel to his command staff, his voice cutting through the celebration with the cold clarity of a man who knew that miracles in the Imperium always came with a price. "Get me the Inquisition," he said. "Tell them we have a situation that requires their immediate attention." The figure in the crater seemed to hear none of this. He stood with his fist still raised, his smile still broad and genuine, and slowly began to walk toward the Imperial lines. Each step was carefully placed, his movements slow and non-threatening, as if he understood that despite his display of force, he was approaching a desperate army that had every reason to shoot first and question later. As he walked, he kept his hands visible, and his voice carried ahead of him with that same impossible volume. "Is everyone all right? Does anyone need medical attention?" The guardsmen on the walls looked at each other, confusion warring with the lingering euphoria of their unexpected salvation. Medical attention was a luxury the 9th Regiment had not known in weeks. Their Medici supplies had run out 5 days ago, and the wounded died or didn't according to factors that had nothing to do with the severity of their injuries and everything to do with their individual resilience and the Emperor's unpredictable favor. The idea that someone would ask about their welfare, as if they were people rather than ammunition, was so foreign that many of them simply stood frozen, unsure how to respond. A single voice answered, weak and cracking with dehydration, from somewhere along the wall's southern section. "We need water, and ammunition, and food, in that order." The figure's smile somehow grew even broader. He reached the base of the wall and looked up at the ramparts, his eyes tracking across the assembled defenders with an intensity that suggested he was trying to memorize each face. Then he nodded, a sharp, decisive gesture, and spoke with the absolute confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem he could not punch into submission. "Then that's what you'll get. Point me toward whoever's in charge of supply distribution, and I'll make sure every one of you has what you need." Commissar Terex arrived at the wall's main gate 10 minutes later, flanked by 2 stormtroopers and carrying his bolt pistol in plain sight. He had not holstered the weapon because he was not yet convinced that this stranger was an ally rather than a threat, and in the Imperium, prudent paranoia kept officers alive long enough to retire. He found the figure waiting patiently beside the gate, hands clasped behind his back, posture relaxed despite standing in the shadow of a fortress wall lined with lasguns pointed in his direction. When Terex approached, the figure turned to face him and offered a slight bow, the gesture stiff and formal as if he were greeting a respected elder rather than a military officer. "Good evening," the figure said, his voice now modulated to something approaching normal conversational volume, though it still carried with preternatural clarity. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance. I didn't have much control over my arrival." Terex studied this strange warrior with the cold assessment of a man who had survived the Imperium's wars by trusting nothing and no one. He saw the scorch marks on the ridiculous costume, the minor burns where plasma had kissed flesh, but beneath the surface damage he saw something that troubled him more. The stranger's chest rose and fell with breaths that seemed too regular, too steady, as if the exertion of single-handedly routing a chaos warband had been nothing more than light exercise. His smile remained fixed, a constant feature of his face like it had been carved there by a sculptor who knew no other expression, and his eyes carried a light that Terex associated with zealots and madmen. "Identify yourself," Terex said, his tone carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Name, rank, and regimental assignment. If you are a sanctioned psyker, produce your inquisitorial seal. If you are a space marine, explain your chapter's absence from Imperial records. If you are neither of these things, Explain what you are before I order my men to open fire." The stranger's smile faltered slightly, confusion flickering across his features. "I'm not any of those things. My name is Toshinori Yagi, though most people know me by my hero name, All Might." He paused, as if expecting recognition, then continued when none came. "I'm a hero, a professional hero. I protect people." Terex felt something cold settle in his stomach. The words made sense individually, but assembled into a statement that carried implications he did not want to examine. A hero, not a soldier, not a warrior, not even a knight in the ancient feudal sense. A hero, as if such a thing could exist outside of propaganda reels and ecclesiastical parables. He raised his bolt pistol slightly, not quite aiming but making his threat clear. "There are no heroes in the Imperium, only servants of the Emperor and those who are not yet dead." All Might's expression shifted into something that looked like genuine sadness. "That's a terrible way to live." "It is the only way to live. Everything else is heresy." "Then maybe heresy isn't as dangerous as you think." The stormtroopers raised their hellguns. Terex's finger tightened on his trigger, and for a moment the gate was balanced on the edge of violence that would have ended with this strange warrior's death or the deaths of every Imperial soldier present. Then All Might raised his hands, palms out, the gesture of peaceful surrender universal across human cultures, regardless of how far they had fallen. "Wait," he said, urgency replacing the sadness in his voice. "I'm not your enemy. I came here by accident, pulled through some kind of dimensional rift, and I found myself in the middle of your battle. I did what I always do. I saved people who needed saving. If that makes me a heretic in your eyes, then we can discuss theology later. Right now, you have wounded soldiers who need help, and I can provide it. Let me do that much, at least." Terex stared at this impossible figure who spoke of dimensional rifts with the casual certainty of someone describing the weather, who claimed to be a hero as if it were a profession rather than a fairy tale, who had destroyed 5 Chaos Marines with his bare hands, and now stood with his hands raised in surrender. Every instinct the Commissar possessed screamed that this was a trick, a deception, some new horror wearing a friendly face. But behind him, on the walls, his men were still cheering. They had seen this stranger save them when the Emperor had not answered their prayers, and if Terex ordered his death now, he would have to execute half his regiment for questioning the decision. He lowered his bolt pistol, though he did not holster it. "You will be escorted at all times. You will touch nothing without permission. You will answer every question put to you with absolute honesty, or I will execute you personally. Do you understand these conditions?" All Might's smile returned, smaller now but no less genuine. "I understand. Thank you for giving me a chance." "Do not thank me. I am not doing this for you. I am doing this because my men need hope more than they need another corpse. Then I'll make sure I don't disappoint them." Terex turned away, gesturing for his stormtroopers to flank the stranger, and began walking toward the gate. That remains to be seen. "The Imperium has broken better men than you, Toshinori Yagi, who calls himself All Might. Let us see how long your optimism survives contact with reality." They passed through the gate into the hive proper, and All Might's smile finally fell away entirely. The reality beyond the walls was worse than anything the battlefield had prepared him for. The streets were choked with refugees, thousands upon thousands of Imperial citizens packed into spaces designed for a fraction of their number, their faces hollow with starvation and their eyes empty of everything except the patient acceptance of death. Children with ribs visible through their skin huddled against adults who were not much better fed, sharing warmth in the chill that perpetually haunted the underhive levels. The elderly lay where they had fallen, too weak to continue and too stubborn to ask for help that would not come. Corpses lined the alleyways, stacked with the efficiency of industrial waste, awaiting cremation or processing into corpse starch rations, depending on which ran out first. The air stank of unwashed bodies and untreated wounds and the sweet sick smell of gangrene. And through it all moved the guardsmen of the 9th Regiment, their faces masks of professional indifference, stepping over the dead without breaking stride. This was normal. This was the Imperium at war, efficient and brutal and utterly unmoved by individual suffering. All Might stopped walking. The stormtroopers bumped into him from behind, cursing, but he did not move. He stood in the middle of the street and stared at the human cost of this war, his eyes tracking from one small tragedy to another, and something in his expression began to crack. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, the gesture unconscious, and his voice when he finally spoke was barely above a whisper. "How long has it been like this?" Terex had continued walking, not realizing his prisoner had stopped, and now he turned back with irritation clear on his face. Like what? This, the refugees, the dead, the children. 17 days since the enemy made planetfall. 4 weeks since the first supply shipment was diverted to more strategically valuable worlds. 3 months since the planetary tithe collectors extracted their quota and left us with insufficient food stores for the civilian population. Terex spoke with the detached precision of someone reciting statistics that had long of conscram since lost their power to move him. This is standard siege conditions. It will get worse before it gets better. Standard, All Might repeated, and the word seemed to physically pain him. You're telling me this is normal? Compared to most Imperial worlds under siege, Carthax Secundus is doing quite well. The civilians are still organized. The disease has not yet spread beyond the lower levels. The PDF has not turned to cannibalism. We have maintained discipline and order, and when reinforcements arrive, we will push the heretics back and resume normal production quotas. This is how the Imperium survives. All Might turned to look at Terex, and the Commissar was startled by the intensity in those blue eyes. This isn't survival. This is slow death dressed up in uniforms and protocols. Welcome to the 41st millennium, Terex said, his voice cold. Where slow death is the best outcome most can hope for. All Might did not respond. He walked forward again, but now his eyes moved constantly, tracking across the faces of the refugees with an attention that bordered on obsessive. He saw a child, perhaps 8 years old, clutching a younger sibling against her chest, both of them shivering despite the industrial heat that should have kept the underhive sweltering. He saw an old man missing both legs, propped against a wall with a begging bowl that contained 3 rust-colored coins. He saw a woman cradling the corpse of her husband, rocking back and forth while humming a lullaby that probably predated the Imperium itself. They walked for 20 minutes through streets that grew progressively more desperate, passing from the refugee camps into the hive's industrial sector, where manufactorums continued their work despite the siege. Here the air tasted of chemical runoff and overheated promethium, and the constant thunder of machinery drowned out individual voices. Workers moved between assembly lines with mechanical precision, their augmetic limbs performing tasks at speeds that would have killed unmodified humans, and overseers with shock mauls patrolled the catwalks above, ready to discipline anyone whose productivity fell below acceptable thresholds. All Might watched a worker collapse at her station, exhaustion or malnutrition, or both finally overcoming her ability to continue. An overseer descended immediately, his shock maul crackling with energy, and struck the fallen worker twice across her back. She did not scream. She pushed herself back to her feet, swaying, and returned to her work while the overseer watched to ensure she maintained her pace. "Stop," All Might said. Terex turned, confused. "Stop what?" "That. What that man just did. Stop him from doing it again. He is maintaining work quotas. If production falls below acceptable levels, the entire hive will be deemed non-compliant, and an orbital sanction will be authorized. That woman's suffering ensures millions survive. That woman is dying. Yes. And when she does, another will take her place. The Manufactorum will continue. The Imperium will continue. Individual deaths are irrelevant against the scale of what we face. All might moved before Terex could react, his speed once again erasing the concept of distance. He covered the 50 meters to the assembly line in what seemed like a single step, appearing beside the overseer with such suddenness that the man dropped his shock maul in surprise. All Might caught it before it hit the ground, his hand closing around the weapon's haft, and crushed it. Metal and wiring compacted into a ball the size of his fist, sparks cascading from the ruin, and he dropped it at the overseer's feet. "No more," All Might said, his voice carrying across the Manufactorum floor despite the industrial noise. "No one else gets beaten, not while I'm here." The Manufactorum went silent. Workers stopped mid-motion, turning to stare at this stranger who had just challenged the brutal efficiency that had governed their lives for as long as most could remember. Overseers along the catwalks raised their shock mauls, uncertain whether to attack or wait for orders, and somewhere in the distance an alarm began to wail. All Might stood in the center of it all, his ridiculous costume bright as a banner against the industrial grime, and his smile had returned, though it carried an edge now, something sharp and dangerous beneath the warmth. Terex arrived seconds later, his stormtroopers with him, and his bolt pistol was no longer lowered. "You have just committed assault against an Imperial overseer and disrupted critical war production. Both are capital offenses. Surrender immediately or be destroyed." All Might looked at the Commissar, and for the first time since his arrival on Carthax Secundus, he seemed to truly see the man standing before him. "You can't be serious. You're actually going to execute me for preventing torture. I am going to execute you for threatening the Imperium's ability to wage war. Your motivations are irrelevant. Then go ahead." All Might spread his arms wide, making himself an easy target. "But before you pull that trigger, ask yourself if killing me will make any of this better. Will it feed those refugees? Will it heal those wounded soldiers? Will it give any of these people a reason to keep fighting beyond simple fear?" Terex raised his bolt pistol, his finger tightening on the trigger, and the Manufactorum held its breath. Every worker, every overseer, every stormtrooper and guardsman present understood that they were witnessing something significant, a moment that would define everything that came after. The Commissar's hand was steady, his aim perfect, and the range was such that he could not possibly miss. All Might did not flinch. He stood with his arms spread, waiting, and his smile had transformed into something that looked almost sad. "I've given my life before," All Might said quietly, though his voice still carried to every corner of the space, "to save others, to inspire them, to show them that someone believed they deserved to be saved. If that's what I have to do again, here in this dark place, then I'll do it gladly. But please, before you make me a martyr, consider whether you're ready for what comes after. Because these people have seen someone stand up for them. They've seen someone fight without cruelty. You can kill me, but you can't kill what I represent. That will survive in their hearts long after my body is cold." Terex's finger remained on the trigger. Seconds stretched. The Manufactorum waited, and in that waiting, something shifted. Workers who had not met their overseer's eyes in years looked up. Guardsmen who had accepted the Imperium's brutality as necessary started to question. The Commissar felt it, that subtle erosion of the absolute certainty that made his authority possible, and he understood with cold clarity that if he pulled this trigger, he would have to execute half the people present to maintain discipline. He lowered his pistol. "You have disrupted war production and assaulted an Imperial official. The penalty is death, but I am staying that sentence pending investigation by the Inquisition. You will be confined to quarters under guard until proper authority can determine your fate. If you resist, If you attempt to interfere with Imperial operations again, I will kill you without hesitation regardless of the consequences. Do you understand?" All Might lowered his arms slowly. "I understand. Thank you for choosing mercy. I am not choosing mercy. I am choosing tactical expediency. Do not confuse the two." They led him away, through streets that seemed somehow brighter despite the perpetual gloom, past refugees who watched his passing with expressions that might have been hope. All Might waved to them as he walked, that absurd gesture of greeting somehow not diminished by his status as a prisoner, and children waved back before their parents could stop them. By the time they reached the officers' quarters in the hive's mid-levels, half the civilian population knew a stranger had arrived who fought without killing and spoke without cruelty. The room they locked him in was a former storage chamber, bare ferrocrete walls and a single glow globe that flickered with the inconsistency of failing power cells. A military cot occupied one corner, its mattress stained with use and body fluids. A waste disposal unit sat in another corner, its mechanisms exposed where the casing had been removed for maintenance and never replaced. There was no window, no decoration, nothing to distinguish it from a cell beyond the absence of bars. Stormtroopers took positions outside the door, their hellguns charged and ready, and Terex departed without another word. All Might sat on the cot and put his face in his hands. The smile was gone now, finally, replaced by an expression of such profound exhaustion that he seemed to age a decade in seconds. His shoulders shook, though no sound escaped him, and his breathing was ragged and uneven. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, though whether with tears or simply the strain of everything he had witnessed, it was impossible to say. "What have I fallen into?" he whispered to the empty room. "What kind of hell is this?" The room did not answer, but beyond the door, the hive continued its brutal work. Children starved, workers collapsed, the wounded died without dignity, and in orbit above it all, ships burned as the Chaos Warband pressed their assault, patient and inexorable as cancer. All Might had saved one battlefield, but the war was everywhere, grinding on with mechanical inevitability. He sat in the darkness and wondered if even the symbol of peace could make a difference in a galaxy that had weaponized despair. The answer arrived 6 hours later. The door to his cell opened without warning, spilling harsh light into the darkness, and a figure entered that made the stormtroopers outside stand at rigid attention. She was tall for a baseline human, nearly 2 meters, and thin in the way of ascetics who had burned away every unnecessary gram of flesh in pursuit of some higher ideal. Her clothing was a patchwork of military utility and religious devotion, flak armor over a black body glove, a heavy coat that fell to her ankles covered in purity seals and devotional script, and at her hip a bolt pistol that looked like it had been maintained with religious care for at least a century. But it was her face that commanded attention. Severe and angular, with eyes that burned with the cold fury of absolute certainty. She carried a skull on a chain around her neck, human-sized and decorated with intricate engravings that caught the light in unsettling ways. A rosette hung beside it, the symbol of the Inquisition wrought in gold and steel, and when she entered the room, the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. "Toshinori Yagi, who calls himself All Might," she said, her voice carrying the clipped precision of someone who had long since abandoned anything resembling small talk. "I am Inquisitor Halrix Vane of the Ordo Hereticus. You will answer my questions with complete honesty, or I will extract the truth through more invasive means. Nod if you understand." All Might stood, his posture straightening despite the exhaustion that lined his face. "I understand, and I'll answer anything you ask, but I want something in return." Vane's expression did not change, but something dangerous flickered in her eyes. "You are not in a position to negotiate." "I'm not negotiating. I'm making a request. Answer my questions after I answer yours, and do it with the same honesty you're demanding from me. You want the truth. So do I." For a long moment, Vane simply stared at him, her gaze seeming to dissect him layer by layer. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. "Acceptable. You first. Where did you come from?" All Might told her. He spoke of a world called Earth, though not the Terra she knew, where humanity had evolved quirks, strange abilities that manifested in 80% of the population and allowed them to perform feats that would be called miracles or mutations depending on one's perspective. He described a society built around heroes and villains, professional protectors who stood against criminals and disasters with powers that ranged from mundane to godlike. He explained how he had been the greatest of these heroes, the symbol of peace who had held back the darkness for decades through the sheer weight of his presence. He described his final battle, the confrontation with All for One that had burned away the last of his power and left him a hollow shell of his former self. He explained how he had passed his quirk to a successor, a boy named Izuku Midoriya who carried now the torch that All Might could no longer bear. And he described the rift, appearing without warning in the middle of a conversation, tearing open reality like a wound and pulling him through into someplace else. "I fell for what felt like hours," All Might said, his voice distant with memory. "Through colors that don't exist and geometries that hurt to perceive. I thought I was dying. Maybe I did die, and this is some kind of afterlife. But then the rift spat me out above your battlefield, and instinct took over. I saw people who needed saving, and I saved them. It's what I've always done. It's all I know how to do." Vane listened without interrupting, her face a mask of professional neutrality, though occasionally she made notes on a data slate that she produced from within her coat. When All Might finished, she was silent for several seconds, processing what she had heard through the lens of someone who had spent decades investigating the impossible. "Your story is either the truth or the most elaborate fiction I have encountered in 40 years of service," she said finally. "The Imperium possesses records of alternate dimensions, pocket realities, and temporal anomalies, though access to such information is restricted to those with sufficient clearance. A dimensional rift is theoretically possible, though the technology to create one deliberately has been lost since the dark age of technology. If you are telling the truth, you are perhaps the most significant archaeological find in recent Imperial history. And if I'm lying, then you are a Psyker or Xenos infiltrator of unprecedented power, and your execution will be performed with extreme prejudice." Vane's tone suggested she found both options equally interesting from an investigative standpoint. "But I do not believe you are lying. Liars construct narratives that align with the listener's expectations. Your story is too alien, too fundamentally incompatible with Imperial reality to be a fabrication. Only the truth is that strange." All Might felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. "Then you'll let me go. Let me help with the war effort." "I will do no such thing. You are a potential threat of incalculable magnitude, and until I understand the full scope of what you represent, you will remain in custody." Vane stepped closer, studying him with the intensity of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. "But I will allow you to ask your questions, as agreed. Choose them carefully." All Might did not hesitate. "Why do you treat your own people like this? The refugees, the workers, the soldiers. I've seen military discipline before, but what I saw in that manufactorum wasn't discipline. It was cruelty dressed up as efficiency." "Because it works," Vane said simply. "The Imperium encompasses 1,000,000 worlds and countless billions of souls, all held together by a bureaucracy so vast that most will never see more than the tiniest fraction of its machinery. We are besieged on all sides by enemies that would see humanity extinguished, enemies that possess advantages we cannot match through compassion or kindness. The Tyranids consume entire worlds. The Orcs fight for the joy of battle. Chaos corrupts from within. Against such foes, we have only numbers and the willingness to expend those numbers without hesitation. Individual suffering is meaningless against the scale of our struggle." That's not a justification, that's an excuse. Vane's expression hardened. You have been in this galaxy for less than a day, and already you presume to judge choices made by those who have fought for centuries to keep humanity alive. Your world, this earth of heroes and quirks, sounds like a paradise by comparison. Ours is hell. We did not choose this. We inherited it from 10,000 years of mistakes and tragedies that compounded until they became the only reality we know. You ask why we are cruel. I ask you what alternative exists when kindness is a luxury no one can afford. All Might opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. He had no answer that would satisfy her, no solution that could be summarized in a single conversation. The gap between his world and this one was too vast, the fundamental assumptions too different. On Earth, heroes existed because society had the resources to support them. Here, the entire civilization was teetering on the edge of extinction, held together by brutality and faith in equal measure. Next question, Vane said. The refugees, the ones dying in the streets, can they be saved? Logistically, yes. Practically, no. To divert resources to their care would mean reducing military readiness, which would increase the likelihood of the hive falling to the enemy. If the hive falls, everyone dies. Therefore, we accept a certain percentage of civilian casualties as the cost of maintaining defensive capability. This is standard triage on every Imperial world facing siege conditions. How many will die before this is over? Assuming reinforcements arrive within the projected timeline, approximately 30% of the civilian population. If the siege extends beyond another month, that number increases to 60%. If the enemy breaks through our lines, 100%. All Might closed his eyes, the numbers hitting him like physical blows. Millions. Yes, and you accept this. I accept reality. You should try doing the same. Vane turned toward the door, preparing to leave, then paused and looked back at him. You fought 5 Chaos Marines today and defeated them with your bare hands. That level of combat effectiveness is rare, even among the Adeptus Astartes. If you were willing to serve the Imperium, if you would swear binding oaths and submit to inquisitorial oversight, I could authorize your deployment against the enemy. You could save lives through killing, rather than through whatever it is you think you're doing. I don't kill, All Might said quietly. Vane stared at him as if he had just claimed the ability to breathe void. Repeat that. I don't kill. It's one of my core principles. I fight to save people, not to end them. Everyone deserves a chance at redemption, even villains, even enemies. The moment I decide that some lives are worth less than others is the moment I stop being a hero and become just another killer with a good excuse. Then you are useless to the Imperium. Vane's voice was flat, emotionless, delivering a verdict she considered self-evident. The enemies we face cannot be redeemed. They have sold their souls to the ruinous powers, twisted their bodies beyond recognition, devoted themselves to the extinction of all that is human. Your mercy would be a gift to them, and a curse to everyone you claim to want to protect. Maybe, or maybe the reason your enemies are so monstrous is because you've never given them any other option. If the only response to opposition is extermination, then of course everyone who opposes you becomes a monster. They have nothing left to lose. You understand nothing. Vane's composure cracked slightly, anger bleeding through the professional distance. I have seen what chaos does to the innocent. I have walked through hive cities where children were sacrificed to summon daemons, where entire populations were twisted into living weapons, where the very walls wept blood and screamed with voices that should not exist. Do not lecture me about alternatives when you have not witnessed the costs of hesitation. In this galaxy, mercy is a strategic weakness that gets billions killed. Then maybe this galaxy needs someone who's willing to be weak. The silence that followed was absolute. Vayne and All Might stared at each other across the small cell, two individuals separated by philosophical chasms, too vast to bridge with simple conversation. Finally, the Inquisitor turned and walked toward the door, her coat swirling behind her with dramatic flair. "I will return tomorrow," she said without looking back. "We will continue this discussion until I determine whether you are an asset or a threat. I advise you to consider your position carefully. The Imperium has no room for heroes who refuse to do what is necessary, and I advise you to consider yours." All Might called after her. "Because sooner or later, all this cruelty is going to destroy you from within. You can't save a civilization by becoming the monsters you're fighting against." Vayne paused in the doorway, her back still to him. "We are already monsters, Toshinori Yagi. We became monsters the moment we accepted that survival requires sacrifices we can never redeem. The only question is whether our monstrosity serves a purpose or simply feeds on itself. At least we're still human enough to ask that question." She left. The door sealed behind her with the heavy finality of a tomb closing, and All Might was alone again in the darkness. He sat back down on the cot and stared at his hands, those massive fists that had broken Chaos Marines and saved a battlefield but could not solve the fundamental sickness at the heart of this civilization. For the first time since his arrival, he began to question whether his presence here was a mistake. Perhaps the galaxy was too broken to save. Perhaps he was just going to make everything worse. The thought was almost comforting in its simplicity, offering an easy exit from the impossible burden of trying to fix something this fundamentally damaged. But even as he entertained it, another thought rose to challenge it, carried in the voice of a boy with green hair and a heart too big for his chest. A hero is someone who can protect everyone's smile, no matter what. Midoriya's words, spoken years ago during training, when the boy had still been new to One for All and struggling under the weight of a power that threatened to break him with every use. All Might had watched his successor grow, had seen him face challenges that would have destroyed lesser individuals, and through it all, Midoriya had held on to that core belief, that everyone deserved to be saved, that no one was beyond hope. If his successor could believe that in a world of heroes and quirks, could All Might do less in a galaxy that had forgotten what hope looked like? He stood, his exhaustion suddenly irrelevant against the weight of renewed purpose. He walked to the door and placed his palm against the cold metal, feeling the vibrations of the hive beyond, the pulse of millions of lives grinding through their desperate existence. The door would not open. He was still a prisoner, still confined and under guard, but that was temporary. Vayne would return tomorrow, and when she did, he would be ready. Not with answers. He did not have those yet, but with a question that he suspected had not been asked in this galaxy for a very long time. What if the Imperium was wrong? Night fell over Carthax Secundus, though the term was relative in a hive where natural sunlight never penetrated below the upper spires. The glow globes dimmed on a timed cycle meant to simulate circadian rhythms, plunging the underhive into a darkness broken only by the fires of the forges and the scattered torches of those too poor to afford artificial light. The Crimson Prophets used the cover of darkness to probe the Imperial defenses, sending cultist suicide squads against the walls in small harassing attacks designed to exhaust the defenders and identify weak points. Las fire lit the night like lightning, and the screams of the dying became a constant background noise that the civilians learned to ignore because acknowledging it meant admitting how thin the line was between them and oblivion. All Might did not sleep. He sat in his cell and listened to the sounds of war filtering through the ferrocrete walls, each distant explosion a reminder of the people dying while he remained imprisoned. His hands clenched and unclenched unconsciously, the gesture of a man struggling against the impulse to tear through walls and rush toward the fighting. But he forced himself to remain still, to think rather than simply react. Rushing out would accomplish nothing except proving Vayne's assessment correct. He needed to understand this place before he could hope to change it. The door opened again near midnight, not Vane this time, but a figure far smaller and more unexpected. A child entered, perhaps 10 years old, dressed in the tattered remains of what had once been a hive worker's coveralls. His face was too old for his years, lined with the kind of exhaustion that came from seeing things no child should witness, and he carried a bundle wrapped in dirty cloth. The stormtroopers outside did not stop him, which suggested either they had orders to allow visitors or the boy had slipped past them with practiced ease. "Mr. Hero," the child said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I brought you food." All Might's surprise must have shown on his face, because the boy smiled slightly, a ghost of the expression children his age should wear constantly. He approached cautiously, as if expecting All Might to vanish or transform into something terrible, and set the bundle on the cot. When unwrapped, it revealed a collection of items that might charitably be called a meal. A piece of corpse starch bread so hard it could probably be used as a weapon, a cup of water so brackish it was nearly opaque, and something that resembled dried meat but smelled like recycled chemical waste. "It's not much," the boy said apologetically, "but Mama said heroes need to eat, and you looked hungry when they brought you in." All Might felt something break inside his chest, some last defensive barrier he had been maintaining against the sheer wrongness of this place. A child, starving himself and his family, had brought food to a stranger because someone had told him heroes need to eat. He reached out and took the bundle with hands that shook slightly, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he did not bother to hide. "What's your name?" "Kelvin. Kelvin Trost." "Thank you, Kelvin. This is the kindest thing anyone has done for me since I arrived." All Might examined the food, his enhanced senses cataloging the nutritional content and finding it desperately insufficient. The bread was mostly filler with trace amounts of actual protein. The meat was synthesized from industrial byproducts and flavored with chemicals. The water contained enough impurities to make a baseline human ill. This was what passed for a meal in the Underhive. "But I can't accept this. You need it more than I do. Mama said you're going to save us, like the saints in the stories the priests tell." Kelvin's eyes were wide with something that might have been hope or might have been desperation. She said, "If we're kind to you, maybe you'll remember us when you're done saving everyone else. Your mother is very wise." All Might carefully rewrapped the bundle and held it out to the boy. "But I'm going to save everyone regardless of whether they bring me food. That's what heroes do. So please, take this back to your family and make sure your little brothers and sisters eat their share." Kelvin stared at the returned food with confusion that slowly transformed into something else, something that looked almost like betrayal. "You're rejecting our offering. Does that mean you're angry with us?" "What? No, of course not." All Might knelt so that he was eye level with the child, his massive frame somehow making itself smaller and less threatening. "I could never be angry with someone for showing kindness. I just want to make sure you're taken care of. You understand that, right? In the Imperium, rejecting an offering means you find us unworthy." Kelvin's voice had gone flat, reciting something he had been taught with the rote precision of catechism. "Unworthy citizens are purged for the good of the whole. Did I do something wrong? Is my family going to be purged?" All Might felt ice form in his stomach. The child was terrified, had worked up the courage to bring food to a stranger despite his fear, and now believed that act of kindness would result in his family's execution. What kind of civilization taught children to think this way? What kind of system made charity into a potential death sentence? He placed his hands on Kelvin's shoulders, gentle but firm, and looked directly into the boy's eyes. "Listen to me very carefully. You did nothing wrong. Your family is not going to be purged. I am not that kind of hero. Where I come from, we teach that the greatest strength is shown in helping others, not in taking from them. You brought me food when you had almost nothing, and that makes you braver than most of the soldiers I've fought beside." "Really? Really?" And I'm going to make you a promise right now. All Might's voice dropped to something just between them, intimate and utterly sincere. I am going to do everything in my power to make sure you and your family survive this war. More than that, I'm going to try to make your life better, give you opportunities you wouldn't have otherwise. That's my job. That's what the symbol of peace does. Kelvin's expression transformed, hope flooding back into features that had been drained of it. You mean it? I've never lied to a child in my life, and I'm not going to start now. The boy threw his arms around All Might's neck, the hug fierce and desperate and heartbreaking in its intensity. All Might returned it carefully, mindful of his strength, and felt the child's tears soaking into his costume's fabric. They stayed like that for several seconds, hero and civilian connected by a simple gesture of human compassion, and then Kelvin pulled back, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. I have to go, the boy said. If the overseers find me gone too long, they'll add penalties to Mama's work quota. Be safe, Kelvin. You too, Mr. Hero. The child left, taking the food bundle with him after All Might insisted 3 more times, and the cell was empty again. But something had changed in the space. Some quality of the air, or perhaps just in All Might's perception of his situation. He was not alone in this galaxy. There were people here who still knew kindness, still practiced compassion despite the brutal machinery grinding overhead. If a child could be brave enough to share his family's food with a stranger, then surely All Might could be brave enough to challenge the system that made such bravery necessary. He stood and walked to the center of the cell, then dropped into a combat stance and began running through exercises. His body moved through the familiar patterns, each technique honed by decades of use, and with each movement he felt his resolve crystallizing into something harder and sharper. Vane had called him useless because he would not kill. The Imperium had deemed him a threat because he questioned their methods, but All Might had never needed approval to do the right thing, and he was not going to start seeking it now. When dawn simulation began and the glow globes brightened to their daytime intensity, he was ready. Vane arrived exactly when she had promised, flanked by a different set of guards and carrying a data slate filled with new questions. She found All Might standing in the center of his cell, posture relaxed but somehow commanding attention nonetheless, and her first words carried a note of approval that surprised both of them. You did not attempt escape. I had given that a 70% probability based on your psychological profile. I gave my word that I would cooperate with your investigation, All Might said. I keep my promises. A novel concept. Most subjects in your position attempt flight within the first 12 hours. Vane gestured, and the guards departed, sealing the door behind them. She stood alone with All Might in the small cell, apparently unconcerned about her safety despite having just locked herself in with someone who could reduce Chaos Marines to their component atoms. I have reviewed the battlefield recordings from yesterday. Your combat capabilities exceed my initial estimates. You moved at speeds approaching those of an Adeptus Astartes, struck with force comparable to power weapons, and sustained fire that should have killed any unarmored target. Yet you show no signs of augmetic enhancement, no evidence of surgical modification. How? I told you, my quirk, one for all. It's a power passed down through generations, each user adding their strength to the stockpile before passing it on. I've held it for over 40 years, though I recently transferred it to my successor. Yet you retained your abilities, some of them. The Embers of One for All, we called it. I'm nowhere near as strong as I was in my prime, but I can still manifest enough power to make a difference. All Might flexed his hands, staring at them as if seeing them for the first time. In my world, I could maintain my muscle form for maybe an hour on a good day. Here, something's different. The moment I arrived, I felt One for All surge back to full strength, like whatever was blocking me before suddenly didn't matter anymore. I don't understand it. Vane's eyes narrowed with interest. The warp functions differently than real space. Psychic phenomena that would be impossible under normal physical laws become trivial when reality is mutable. If your power has any connection to the immaterium, even tangentially, proximity to warp-tainted space could amplify its effectiveness. Is that what this galaxy is? Warp-tainted? The galaxy is a battleground between materium and immaterium, physical reality and the realm of souls and thought. Every sentient being with emotions contributes to the warp, feeding it power that manifests as daemons and dark gods who hunger for mortal existence. The Imperium stands as a bulwark against that corruption, maintaining order through force because any other approach would allow chaos to consume us from within. All Might absorbed this, his expression troubled. So your enemies are literally fed by negative emotions, fear, anger, despair, yes. Then doesn't it seem counterproductive to build an entire civilization on those same emotions? You're feeding the very thing you're trying to fight. Vane was silent for a long moment. That paradox has been debated by inquisitors and ecclesiarchs for millennia. The general consensus is that controlled fear and righteous anger are preferable to the uncontrolled despair and forbidden pleasures that chaos offers. We channel humanity's darkness into forms that serve survival rather than damnation. That's not solving the problem. That's just deciding which poison to drink. Welcome to the Imperium. We are all slowly poisoning ourselves in hopes that we die slower than our enemies. All Might shook his head, frustration evident in every line of his body. There has to be another way. There has to be something between your system and total annihilation. If you discover it, please inform the High Lords of Terra. I am certain they would be fascinated to hear your solution to a problem that has defeated 10,000 years of strategic planning. The sarcasm was heavy enough to be tactile, but All Might did not rise to the bait. Instead, he asked the question that had been building since Kelvin's visit. What happens to the civilians when this siege ends? Assuming you win and push the chaos forces back, do things get better for them? Define better. Do they get more food, medical care, time to rest and recover from the trauma of living through a war? Vane consulted her data slate, scrolling through files with practiced efficiency. Projections indicate that once the immediate military threat is eliminated, Carthax Secundus will be required to increase production quotas to compensate for the disruption. Work shifts will be extended from 16 hours to 18 hours for a period of 6 months, during which time civilian rations will be reduced by 15% to build strategic reserves. Medical resources will be prioritized for military personnel until such time as the planetary defense force is restored to full strength. Casualties among the civilian population will be replaced through accelerated breeding programs and immigration from less strategically valuable worlds. Replaced, All Might repeated, his voice hollow. Like their equipment that wore out, they are components in a system that must continue functioning regardless of individual preferences. This is not cruelty for its own sake. This is the minimum level of efficiency required to maintain Imperial operations across 1 million worlds. And no one questions this? No one looks at this system and thinks maybe there's something wrong with treating people like expendable resources? Those who question are investigated for heretical sympathy. Those who question repeatedly are purged. This is necessary to maintain ideological cohesion across interstellar distances where communication can take months or years. Doubt is a luxury we cannot afford. All Might turned away from her, his shoulders tight with tension that had nothing to do with physical threat and everything to do with moral exhaustion. He walked to the wall and placed both palms against the ferrocrete, as if he could push through it and escape not just the cell but the entire nightmarish reality he had fallen into. His voice, when he spoke again, was barely above a whisper. I can't accept this. I can't accept that this is the only way. Then you will die, Vane said with absolute certainty. Perhaps not today, perhaps not even this year, But eventually you will attempt to change something fundamental about the Imperium's operation, and the system will eliminate you. Not because you are wrong, but because allowing one individual to reshape our civilization based on personal philosophy would set a precedent that destroys us faster than any external enemy. The Imperium survives through rigidity, through absolute adherence to doctrine, through the elimination of variables that cannot be controlled. Then the Imperium is already dead. It just hasn't stopped moving yet. Vane's expression shifted, something like respect flickering across her features for the first time. Perhaps. But it is the only defense humanity has, and I would rather serve a dead god that protects than a living one that devours. At least the Emperor, for all his silence and distance, does not demand we corrupt ourselves for his pleasure. The Emperor. All Might turned back to face her, his eyes searching her face for something he could not quite articulate. You keep mentioning this Emperor. Tell me about him. He is the master of mankind, the God Emperor who sits upon the golden throne on Terra, holding back the darkness through his eternal sacrifice. He has been dying for 10,000 years, sustained only by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psykers whose souls feed his power. Without him, the Astronomicon would fail, warp travel would become impossible, and the Imperium would shatter into isolated worlds that could not defend themselves against the enemies that surround us. He is everything and nothing, present and absent. The foundation upon which our civilization is built, and the reason that civilization must be so brutal. All Might felt sick. You sacrifice 1,000 people every day to keep one man alive. We sacrifice 1,000 psykers who would otherwise become vulnerabilities to demonic possession to maintain the beacon that allows interstellar travel. It is efficient resource management. It's murder on an industrial scale. It is survival. And before you judge us too harshly, remember that those psykers die knowing their sacrifice serves a purpose. They go to their deaths willingly, believing they join the Emperor in his eternal vigil. Is that so different from your heroes, who risk their lives to protect others? My heroes choose to take those risks. They're not rounded up and forced onto an altar. Neither are our psykers. They are identified, trained, and given the choice to serve or be sanctioned. Most choose service because the alternative is either death or lobotomization into servitor drones. We provide the illusion of choice because it makes the sacrifice easier to bear, but the outcome is predetermined. This is kinder than forcing them at gunpoint. All Might stared at her, trying to find words that could bridge the gap between their worldviews and coming up empty. Everything she said made sense from a certain brutal perspective. A utilitarian calculus that prioritized survival over morality. But accepting that perspective meant abandoning everything he believed, everything he had fought for across decades of heroism. If he accepted the Imperium's logic, he would have to accept that his entire life had been built on naive idealism. He would have to accept that there was no such thing as a hero. The thought was intolerable. I want to help, he said finally. Not the way you want me to, killing and destroying, but there has to be something I can do that doesn't require me to compromise my principles. Vane considered him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. There is one possibility. The refugee camps in the lower hive are experiencing outbreaks of disease that threaten to spread to the military sectors. We lack the Medicae resources to contain it through traditional means, but your physical abilities might prove useful for transport and heavy lifting. If you are willing to work under inquisitorial supervision, I can authorize your temporary release for humanitarian purposes. Yes. All Might did not hesitate. Absolutely yes. When do we start? Now. She turned and walked toward the door, which opened at her approach. All Might followed, his heart lighter than it had been since his arrival despite the grim task ahead. Disease and refugees and the grinding misery of the Underhive awaited, but at least he would be doing something, helping people rather than sitting idle while they suffered. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was a start. They descended through the hive's levels, passing from the mid-spires where officers and administrators maintained their fragile bubble of civilization into the underhive, where that civilization frayed and broke. The temperature rose with each level, the geothermal heat of the planet's core combining with waste warmth from the manufactorums to create an environment that approached lethal for extended exposure. The air grew thick with pollutants, each breath an act of slow poisoning, and the light dimmed to the point where glow globes became scarce luxuries rather than standard features. The refugee camps occupied what had once been industrial storage sectors, vast spaces designed to hold raw materials and finished products now crammed with human misery. Tens of thousands occupied areas meant for hundreds, their bodies packed so tightly that movement was only possible in single file through narrow corridors between improvised shelters. The smell was overwhelming, a combination of unwashed bodies, untreated waste, and the sickly sweet odor of advancing disease. Medicaid servitors moved through the camps with mechanical efficiency, their diagnostic scanners identifying the sick and marking them with bright paint for collection. Collection meant death. There was no cure, no treatment, only quarantine and cremation to prevent spread. All Might watched a servitor mark a child, perhaps 6 years old, with a red X across her forehead. The girl did not cry. She simply stood still while her mother held her, both of them silent with the acceptance of the inevitable. He felt something snap inside his chest, some final restraint that had been holding back his fury at this entire sick system. "No," he said, and his voice carried with that impossible volume that made everyone in the immediate area turn to stare. "Absolutely not. She's not dying today." Vane appeared at his elbow, her expression warning him against exactly what he was about to do. "The disease is highly contagious and universally fatal in the immunocompromised. That child has perhaps 3 days before her organs begin to fail. Allowing her to remain among the healthy population risks exponential spread. Then we'll treat her. We'll find medicine, antibiotics, whatever this disease responds to. We have no such resources. The Medicaid supplies were exhausted weeks ago, and our requests for resupply have been deprioritized in favor of more strategically valuable worlds. The child will die regardless of your intervention. The only question is whether she dies alone or takes others with her." All Might knelt beside the child and her mother, his massive frame somehow not threatening despite the raw power it represented. He looked into the girl's eyes, fever-bright and too large for her face, and spoke with a gentleness that seemed impossible given the horror surrounding them. "What's your name?" "Seria," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "Seria. That's a beautiful name." All Might smiled, and despite everything, despite the disease and the despair and the death that surrounded them, it was genuine. "I'm going to help you, Seria. I don't know exactly how yet, but I promise I will figure something out. Do you believe me?" The child stared at him with eyes that had seen too much, that carried the weight of a life lived in conditions that would have broken adults. Then, slowly, she nodded. "You're the hero everyone's talking about, the one who doesn't give up." "That's right, and heroes don't break their promises." He stood and turned to Vane, his expression hardening into something that carried echoes of the symbol of peace at his most terrible, when villains realized they were not facing a man but a force of nature wearing human skin. "Show me to your Medicaid facilities. I'm going to find a cure, and I'm going to save this girl, and then I'm going to save everyone else in this camp who doesn't deserve to die because the Imperium can't be bothered to prioritize their lives. You are not qualified to." I spent 40 years fighting villains whose quirks ranged from fire manipulation to biological warfare. I've been poisoned, infected, and exposed to more diseases than your Medicaid have names for, and I survived them all through sheer determination and intelligent application of resources. I may not understand your technology, but I understand medicine, and I understand that giving up on patients who can still be saved is not medicine at all, It's just eugenics with better branding." Vane stared at him, and for the first time since they had met, she seemed genuinely uncertain. "Even if you could synthesize a cure, which I doubt, distributing it to this many people would require resources we do not have. You would be creating expectations we cannot fulfill, raising hopes that will inevitably be crushed. Then I'll fulfill them myself." All Might's voice dropped to something quieter but no less intense. "You keep telling me about limitations, about what's possible and what isn't, about how the system works, but I've made a career out of doing the impossible, and I'm not going to stop now just because your civilization has decided despair is more efficient than hope. Show me to the Medicae facilities, or I will tear through this hive until I find them myself." For a long moment, the Inquisitor and the hero stood locked in a silent battle of wills, two individuals representing fundamentally incompatible approaches to an impossible situation. Then Vane turned and began walking deeper into the underhive, her coat swirling behind her. "Follow me," she said. "But when this fails, when you realize that determination cannot overcome material limitations, remember that I warned you. And when it succeeds," All Might replied, "remember that you helped me." They descended further into darkness, and behind them, in the refugee camp, Syria's mother held her daughter close and whispered prayers to an emperor who had never answered before but might listen now that a hero had made a promise. Hope was dangerous in the Imperium, but sometimes danger was exactly what people needed. The Medicae facility occupied a section of the underhive that had once served as a water reclamation plant, its machinery repurposed to sterilize instruments and synthesize basic medical supplies. The space was vast but understaffed. A handful of overworked Medicae servitors and exhausted human assistants attempting to manage triage for thousands of wounded and sick. The air reeked of antiseptic and decay in equal measure, and the floor was sticky with fluids that the cleaning servitors could not process fast enough. All Might entered like a force of nature, his eyes scanning the facility with the practiced assessment of someone who had visited too many disaster sites to count. He saw surgical theaters where doctors performed amputations without anesthetic because the pain suppressants had run out. He saw rows of cots holding soldiers with wounds that would have been easily treatable in his world, but here simply festered until infection killed them. He saw children with malnutrition so severe their bones showed through translucent skin, and elderly citizens who had been triaged as non-priority, left in corners to die with whatever dignity could be salvaged. He walked to the nearest Medicae station and addressed the servitor there, his voice carrying command despite his lack of official authority. "I need complete information on the disease spreading through the refugee camps. Symptoms, progression, mortality rate, and any treatments that have been attempted." The servitor's optical sensors focused on him, mechanical eyes processing his presence through logic matrices that had no category for hero. Its response was delivered in flat Gothic laced with machine code bursts. "Query invalid. Petitioner lacks medical credentials and Mechanicus authorization for restricted data access. Override that restriction. Inquisitorial Authority Halrix Vane, Authorization Code." Vane rattled off a string of numbers and phrases that made the servitor's cogitators whir with processing strain. Its eyes flickered, and a moment later, a data slate extended from its torso on a mechanical arm. "Data access granted. Disease designated underhive rot. Strain, XIV. Bacterial infection exacerbated by malnutrition and environmental toxins. Progression from initial infection to organ failure averages 72 hours in immunocompromised subjects. Mortality rate, 97.3%. Effective treatments, none. Palliative care protocols, quarantine and cremation." All Might took the data slate and began scrolling through the information with speed that suggested either enhanced reading comprehension or desperate focus. The disease was bacterial, which meant it could theoretically be treated with antibiotics, but the Imperium's supplies had been exhausted and producing more required resources currently allocated to more critical functions. Without treatment, the infection would spread through the refugee camps within days, killing thousands before burning itself out through lack of hosts. What about the manufactorums? All Might asked, his mind racing through possibilities. They produce chemicals for industrial use, right? Some of those chemicals must have antibiotic properties, even if they're not specifically designed for medical applications. Vane shook her head. The manufactorums produce promethium, plasteel components, and munitions, nothing with medical applications. Everything has medical applications if you're creative enough. All Might turned to face her, his eyes bright with the intensity of someone who had just seen a solution. In my world, we discovered antibiotics by accident. Penicillin came from mold. Other drugs came from plants that people thought were just weeds. The principle is universal. Complex organic compounds can disrupt bacterial cell walls or interfere with reproduction. If your manufactorums produce any organic chemicals, even as byproducts or waste, there's a chance some of them have the properties we need. That is, Vane paused, visibly recalculating, that is not entirely implausible. But identifying which chemicals might be effective would require testing protocols we do not have time or resources to implement. Then we'll use me as the test subject. All Might pulled off one of his gloves, revealing the hand beneath. With his other hand, he produced a piece of metal he had palmed from his cell, a nail left behind by careless maintenance workers, and drew it across his palm. Blood welled up, bright red against his skin. Infect me with the disease. Introduce it directly into my bloodstream. Then we start testing chemical compounds from the manufactorums. My healing factor will keep me alive long enough to find something that works. You cannot be serious. I'm completely serious. Saria has maybe 3 days to live. I don't have time to run proper trials or convince your bureaucracy to allocate resources they've already decided are better spent elsewhere. This is the fastest way to get results. Vane stared at him as if seeing him for the first time, her professional detachment cracking to reveal something that might have been respect or might have been horror. You are proposing to intentionally infect yourself with a disease that has a 97% mortality rate, then experiment with industrial chemicals that could be as likely to kill you as cure you, all on the chance that you might discover a treatment in time to save one child. Yes, that is magnificently stupid. It's what heroes do. The Inquisitor opened her mouth to argue further, then closed it again. She turned to the Medicae servitor and issued a series of rapid commands in binary cant, her fingers dancing through the air in shapes that hurt to look at. The servitor responded with its own burst of machine language, then extended another mechanical arm tipped with a syringe filled with viscous brown fluid. This is a concentrated sample of the underhive rot bacteria, Vane said, her voice carefully neutral. If you inject this, you will be infected. Are you absolutely certain about this course of action? All Might took the syringe without hesitation and pressed it against his bleeding palm, depressing the plunger with his thumb. The fluid entered his bloodstream, and he felt nothing at first, just the cold of the liquid and the minor sting of the injection. Then his enhanced metabolism engaged, his body recognizing the foreign bacteria and mobilizing defenses that would be insufficient against this particular enemy. He felt his temperature rise slightly, the first sign of systemic infection, and his vision sharpened with the hyper-focus that came from controlled adrenaline response. "Clock's ticking," he said, handing the empty syringe back to Vane. "Let's get to work." The next 16 hours were a blur of chemical testing and controlled suffering. Vane commandeered access to the manufactorum's industrial chemical stores and returned with dozens of samples, everything from waste byproducts to cleaning solvents to lubricants used in machinery maintenance. All Might tested them systematically, introducing small amounts of each compound to his system and monitoring the disease's response. Most did nothing. Some made the infection worse, accelerating bacterial reproduction and driving his fever higher. A few killed bacteria but also damaged his cells, causing internal bleeding that his healing factor struggled to repair. Through it all, he remained conscious and focused, his will holding back the pain and disorientation that would have incapacitated anyone less stubborn. The Medicae servitors monitored his vitals with mechanical detachment, their sensors tracking his declining condition with the precision of machines that had no concept of mercy. Vane watched from a distance, her expression unreadable, occasionally making notes on her data slate but never interfering. By hour 12, All Might's fever had reached dangerous levels, his vision blurred, and his hands shook with tremors he could not fully control. The infection had spread to his lungs, each breath a labored rasp that echoed through the Medicae facility. But he kept testing, kept pushing compounds into his system because Seria had less than 60 hours now, and every minute he spent failing brought her closer to the same death. At hour 14, he found it. The compound was a byproduct of plasteel synthesis, a complex organic molecule that the Mechanicus considered waste and routinely incinerated. When All Might introduced it to his bloodstream, he felt the fever break almost immediately, his temperature dropping as his immune system suddenly found traction against the bacteria. His breathing eased. His vision cleared. Within 30 minutes, the infection was in full retreat, his enhanced healing factor mopping up the remnants with ruthless efficiency. He stood, swaying slightly, and turned to Vane with a smile that was equal parts triumph and exhaustion. "We have our cure. Now we just need to mass produce it. That compound is toxic to baseline humans in the concentrations required for effectiveness," Vane said, consulting readouts from the Medicae servitors. "Your enhanced physiology can tolerate it, theirs cannot." All Might felt his smile falter, hope giving way to desperation. "Then we dilute it. Find a carrier solution that reduces toxicity while maintaining effectiveness. That will require additional testing that will take days we do not have. Then we'll work faster." They did. All Might pushed his body beyond any reasonable limit, intentionally reinfecting himself again and again while testing different dilution ratios and carrier solutions. Each iteration brought him closer to death, his healing factor strained to its breaking point, but each iteration also brought him closer to a formula that could save thousands. Vane, despite her professed skepticism, threw herself into the work with an intensity that suggested she was as invested in this impossible gamble as he was. At hour 26, they succeeded. A dilution of 1 part compound to 20 parts saline solution proved effective against the bacteria while remaining within tolerable toxicity ranges for baseline human physiology. All Might collapsed against a wall, his body finally demanding rest it could no longer be denied, but his laughter echoed through the Medicae facility with the relief of someone who had bet everything on a single desperate play and won. "We did it," he said, his voice hoarse but jubilant. "We actually did it." Vane stood over him, her expression complex and difficult to parse. "Yes, against all probability and common sense, you forced a solution through sheer bloody-minded refusal to accept failure. The Mechanicus will want to study this compound, codify the synthesis process, and add it to the official pharmacopoeia. You may have just saved millions across hundreds of worlds. Right now, I just want to save one little girl named Seria. Then we should move quickly. The infection in the refugee camps has progressed during your experiments. Many who were marked for cremation may already be beyond saving." All Might forced himself to his feet, swaying but upright. "Then we'll save whoever we can. That's all anyone can do." They returned to the refugee camps with Medicae servitors carrying synthesized doses of the cure, enough to treat the most critical cases immediately and buy time for mass production to catch up with demand. The servitors moved through the crowds with mechanical efficiency, administering injections to everyone marked with red paint, and within hours the first signs of recovery began to appear. Fevers broke. Breathing eased. Color returned to faces that had been gray with the